Thank you, Mr. President. In my contribution, I'll share some of the feedback I've received from key stakeholders and sum up my own concerns to outline why I don't support the bill. Mr. President, we heard this morning in one of the many briefings we had, which I appreciated, from the Vice President of the Local Government Association of Tasmania and the CEO of the Local Government Association of Tasmania, and they shared some information on behalf of the sector that clearly articulated the local government sector does not support the DAPs proposal from the government. And they shared that there was a unanimous vote last week by local government councils to reject the DAP legislation. In fact, at the Legat General Meeting on the 21st of November, the sector voted unanimously in support of the following motion: that Legat informs the state government that the local government sector, 1, rejects the DAP legislation, 2, is extremely disappointed by the government's approach, and 3, remains open to professional consultation and collaboration with the Parliament. Mr. President, it is very strongly the view of the local government sector that this legislation is not needed, and the government's own position paper from last year said this. I quote the position paper, which said, "Despite the statistical evidence, there remains a perception that some councils are less supportive of new development than others." It went on to say, "Our development assessment process was one of, if not the, fastest in the country." And Mr. President, Tasmania's development assessment system is in fact the fastest in the country. Discretionary applications are being determined in a median time frame of 38 days, an average time frame of 40 days, and permitted applications are being determined in 21 days. Compared to other states, Tasmanian councils are on average 6 days faster than South Australia, 15 days faster than the Northern Territory, 21 days faster than the ACT, 43 days faster than New South Wales, 45 days faster than Queensland, around 40 to 50 days faster than WA, and 89 days faster than Victoria in assessing development applications. Unfortunately, there is little more than ideology and politics behind this bill, Mr. President. Despite this, local government has remained open to working with the government on DAPs, but this has been rejected at every turn. From when the Premier first announced their intention to establish DAPs in July last year and again in October last year, the local government sector asked the state government to proactively engage with local government on this issue, who are undeniably the experts in this area. Not only did the government ignore these offers and also pretty much all of the feedback councils provided on the position paper, but the Minister and Premier then descended to little more than name-calling once they released the draft bill. Legat and the local government sector condemned the state government's approach to consultation on this bill. It provided bare minimum timeframes that are inflexible and unresponsive to the voice of local government and others. It has completely ignored Council's previous submissions on the DAPs position paper in late 2023, many of which presented opportunities to work collaboratively with government on a constructive proposal. This opportunity now goes begging because the government has chosen this path of conflict and assigning blame. Councils, and I was at Glenorchy City Council in October last year when we endorsed a submission to the consultation process, and we engaged in that consultation genuinely, giving thought, rational thought, and presenting fair-minded views based on their technical expertise. In reviewing Council's 2023 submissions, you see the majority of councils were open to a well-designed DAP process, but could see the case had not yet been properly made and could not support the proposal presented to them at that time. This openness and genuine engagement has not been reciprocated by the state government. There's been no attempt to listen to local government and understand their needs. No attempt to understand their needs has been made. This brings, sadly, Mr. President, the sentiment within planning in Tasmania close to crisis levels. Development professionals across the sector feel disenfranchised and alienated by the government's choice to attack rather than support. We've seen and we've heard, Mr. President, that a total of 7 days from when the government closed consultation on the draft bill to the time in which it was tabled in Parliament. This clearly signals no intention to consider, let alone respond to any feedback provided on the draft bill. This is not consultation, it is not leadership, and it has really disappointed the local government sector. I said, Mr. President, the local government is undeniably the experts in the planning system. Their views are important and should not be dismissed. Mr. President, councils, planning staff assess and process more than 12,000 development applications each year. It's not just councils that have raised concerns with this bill either. The highly respected Tasmanian Planning Commission said in its submission that the local government sector already administers development assessment processes efficiently, and this new process will add further layers to an already complex planning system. It will require the duplication of administrative and technical functions, and it will result in a more expensive planning system. A more expensive planning system. More cost to the taxpayers, more cost to developers, more cost to councils. Let's just reflect on these comments. The actual body that will be responsible for implementing the DAPs has said it will increase the complexity, the cost and the administration. More red tape, not less. Despite the rhetoric from the government, this bill actually seeks to firmly put the politics into planning. Land use planning is complex. This bill is complex. It should not be rushed through after little more than tokenistic consultation on the actual draft bill. 7 days, written submissions only. Is that proper consultation on what is a significant change to our planning system? I touched on some figures in relation to Tasmania being the fastest in terms of assessing planning applications, and I think it's also beneficial to reflect on some of the statistics on how councils and the planning system is performing. So as I mentioned, each year there are around 12,000 development applications assessed, and this number is growing. Of those, there are around 5,000 discretionary applications, of which just 1% are refused. Specifically, in 2022-23, there were 5,303 discretionary applications, and 1% of these, or 53, were refused. Just 53 applications for development permits refused. Let's compare that with the record of the Tasmanian Planning Commission. Over the past 6 years, the Tasmanian Planning Commission refused an average of 10% of planning scheme amendments and 18% of combined permit and amendment applications. All of these were approved by the relevant council. Based on the record, councils are more likely to approve a development than the Tasmanian Planning Commission. What about appeals, Mr. President? There were almost double the appeals, 1.9%, or 102 development approvals, than refusals. Remember, there were 53 refusals. There were as many third-party appeals as applicant appeals. This indicates there is a significant proportion of appealing approvals to negotiate conditions, and this can't happen under the DAP. Under the model proposed in this bill, there's no appeal right. At TASCAT, 70 to 80% of appeals are mediated. This can't happen under the DAP. Under the model proposed, there is no avenue for mediation. In 2022-23, there were 21 full appeals. Of these, 10 were council approvals and 11 were refusals. 13 were appealed by the applicant and 8 by third parties. Only 6 times, in 29% of appealed decisions, did TASCAT disagree with the council. 15 times TASCAT affirmed the council's decisions. That's 71% of the time TASCAT is upholding council's decision. So, Mr. President, what problem is this bill trying to address? The fact is, the issues with our planning system are as a result of the failure of the government to maintain the foundations of the system. If we look at the critical foundations of our planning system, they are either missing or out of date. For example, the 3 regional land use strategies are nearing 15 years old, and they are critical to guiding local development and increasing certainty for developers. This is where the investment in extra resources, if there is any, needs to go. Both local government and the Planning Institute of Australia have been asking for these to be updated for years. This is a state responsibility. The outdated nature creates development uncertainty, conflict, and hinders local decision making. We have seen that just yesterday with issues we were contemplating here on Stony Rise, which the government has now chosen to create specific legislation to address. This is hardly taking the politics out of planning, Mr. President. Western Australia has recently undertaken a review of their DAP system after 9 years of operation. This found the rates of refusal for DAs by DAPs now sits between 11 and 13%, down from the high rate of 19.5% in 2015-16, compared to local government, where the refusal rate is only 2%. Again, to recap and be clear about the situation here, in 2022-23 there were 102 DAs appealed. 70 to 80% were resolved through mediation. 21 went to a tribunal hearing, and of these, just 6 council decisions were overturned. What is the problem we are trying to address here? The evidence is clear. These statistics don't lie. This bill is not needed. It cannot be implemented by the TPC. It will increase the cost and complexity of planning. It will introduce duplication, and most damning for the government, based on the TPC's rate of refusal and the evidence from the WA experience, this will be bad for developers. Moving on, that was some of the information shared by Legat, and I appreciate and acknowledge their contribution there. Also received feedback, Mr. President, from general managers and mayors of local government, of councils, some of whom have had decades of experience in planning. And in short, to summarise 5 key concerns from a general manager who has decades of experience in planning, he says concern number 1 is the ministerial interference in the development assessment process. Concern number 2, the DAPs create a complex, chaotic, multi-touch process resulting in more red tape and cost shifting to local government. Concern number 3, developers are given more avenues for ministerial influence. Concern number 4, applicants can forum shop, resulting in more system complexity and a reduced certainty of process. And concern number 5, the DAPs will have an adverse impact on the public notification process and appeal rights. This General Manager also put forward the confirmation that Council is on the record that it does not object to the concept of development assessment panels, and nor do I, Mr. President. However, no evidentiary base has been established to justify the model proposed. This General Manager also conveyed their concerns about the government's failure to respond to concerns from earlier engagement and consultation. Council provided a submission on the DAP discussion paper in November 2023, indicating that whilst it's not opposed to the concept of a development assessment panel, particularly for assistance in technical skill, there are a number of concerns with the proposed scope and operation of such a panel. It is disappointing, said the General Manager, that given the extensive number of submissions highlighting similar concerns, the draft bill has been prepared seemingly with little or no regard to them. This is information that was provided in response to the consultation process in November last year. 12 months ago, 12 months, the government have had this information and have not reached out to further consult with councils on the information provided or factored it in to the drafting to make it a proposition that is acceptable to councils. Of the 5 major concerns that Council raised in its November submission, the bill fails to respond to 3 concerns, has changed what is proposed to make 1 concern even worse, and provides a limited and insubstantial response to the other concern. In short, Mr. President, the model proposed in the draft bill is philosophically bankrupt. The model argues there are situations where councils are conflicted and therefore unlikely to make sound planning decisions. Yet the model relies on councils effectively making a decision at a first instance, which is then subject to review by a panel, or providing advice in the first instance to help inform the DAP's considerations and decision. So the very foundation of the model, i.e. of purportedly relieving councils of their planning authority role, is defeated. And by not advertising applications until a recommendation has been made by the council, until a draft assessment has been prepared, the bill is really just leaving councils hanging out to dry. It's leaving them vulnerable, Mr. President, to community outrage that community doesn't have a voice through the councils providing advice on an assessment process done by a DAP. Not only this, the design is then utilised to enable a sham review process as a device to remove people's appeal rights. These measures would significantly undermine public confidence in the system and exacerbate controversy. The proposed model will also have resourcing impacts on councils as well as the TPC. There will likely be significant impacts on resourcing the process whereby council provides advice or a view to the TPC. And whilst yet unclear, it seems unlikely planning authorities will receive fees for such applications. It would seem likely that the TPC will receive fees for these applications, whereas currently councils receive fees for applications that they assess. Yet they'd still be required to understand significant assessment, administration and enforcement associated with these applications. Councils are also concerned with the impacts of resourcing assessments. I just said that. They will be required to potentially assess an application. Oh, I've just said that, sorry. We'll move on. Ministerial interference is also a key concern of councils and politicisation of the planning system. The proposed model will absolutely create ministerial interference in development assessment processes and compromise the integrity of this aspect of the resource management and planning system of Tasmania. An ad hoc process determined by the Minister on a case-by-case basis does not represent procedural fairness and cannot be supported. This is not taking the politics out of planning, Mr. President. This particular council, again, remains open to working with the government on a DAP model. Looks forward to beneficial dialogue and significant re-engineering of what is proposed to ensure that a DAP model for Tasmania is philosophically sound, efficient, well-resourced and builds confidence in our planning system rather than serving to undermine it. And I think that really sums up the mood of the sector in being open to working on reform and a model, but not in any way supporting what's proposed in this bill. Another particular council, this correspondence from a mayor, also refers to the complexity of the system and how this proposed model further complicates the system. This mayor says the art of crafting legislation is to make it detailed enough to be operable while simple enough to be followed. The approvals process in Tasmania are already characterised by multiple pathways of assessment and referrals that leave the average citizen completely bamboozled by how to get an approval for sometimes something as simple as a shed in their backyard. Keep it simple. The introduction of yet another assessment pathway will not streamline or simplify proceedings, Mr. President. It will further complicate it. We've also, honourable members, received feedback, Mr. President, from the Tasmanian Planning Commission, who did refer to the significant resourcing implications not only for the Commission, but also for the planning sector more generally, again going to the point that this is going to make the planning system more costly and more prolonged for everyone. Also received feedback from planners privately working in the sector, sharing concerns about the proposed changes. One particular planner who's worked in planning in Tasmania for 40 years, Mr. President, is strongly opposed to the proposed legislation to create DAPs and says the measure diminishes the role of purposeful planning by increasing unwarranted ministerial power over the planning system. Transparency, independence, accountability and public participation are all curtailed by the proposed process. This planner believes planning decisions should remain with their duly elected government representatives with continuing opportunities for public review and appeal. This planner says they are concerned that the changes will further politicise the planning process, not take the politics out of planning. They'll give property developers a licence to bypass community input and duly elected local council representatives. The Minister will be able to force the initiation of a planning scheme changes, perversely, only when a local council has rejected such an application, threatening transparency and threatening strategic planning. This planner also talks about the concerns of removing merit-based planning appeal rights via the Planning Tribunal on issues that the community cares about, like impacts on biodiversity, height, bulk, scale or appearance of buildings, impacts to streetscapes and adjoining properties, including privacy and overlooking, traffic, noise, smell, light and so much more, which will alienate community members and create division in the community. TASCAT review of government decisions is an essential part of the rule of law and a democratic system of government based on checks and balances. Mainland research demonstrates that removing merits-based planning appeals has the potential to reduce good planning outcomes, including both environmental and social outcomes. This concern also, Mr President, is that removing merits-based planning appeals has the potential to increase corruption, reduce good planning outcomes, favour developers and undermine democracy. The New South Wales Independent Commission Against Corruption recommended the expansion of merit-based planning appeals as a deterrent to corruption. Mainland experience demonstrates planning panels favour developers and undermine democratic accountability. Local planning panels, which are often dominated by members of the development sector, were created in New South Wales to stamp out corruption, but councillors from across the political spectrum say they favour developers and undermine democratic accountability. In summary, this planner, as I said, who has 40 years in the system, says there is no problem to fix, referring to the 1% of council planning decisions that go to appeal, and Tasmania's planning system being already the fastest in Australia when it comes to determining development applications. The government wants to falsely blame the planning system for stopping housing development to cover its lack of performance in addressing the affordable housing shortage. This legislation, Mr President, is not about housing. It is a disingenuous attempt to insert those with politically vested interests into the system in an unfair manner against the community's valid interests in how our state develops. So I appreciate all of the community members and organisations who have taken time and energy to share their thoughts with honourable members, and I'm pleased to be able to put some of those on the record here in contributing to my contribution to debate here today. In summing up, it's a furphy, Mr President, to say that this bill removes the politics from planning. In fact, it can be argued that the opposite is true. This bill grants the Minister the power to refer a permit application to the DAP. It is entirely misleading to claim this bill removes the politics from planning. It is also misleading and unfair to say that we have a quantified problem with politics in planning anyway. That is not a sound justification for the introduction of DAPs. The statistics don't lie, and they tell a very different story to the government's narrative. I know from the hundreds of emails I've received that many individual community members share these concerns raised by local government and the planning sector too, Mr President. The community's opportunity to have a say in planning decisions and the stage at which they can have a say will be significantly adversely affected by the DAP model proposed in this bill, and this is of great concern. In fact, for applications assessed by a DAP, neighbouring properties won't even be notified that an application has been made. Further, the community won't have the opportunity to have a say until an initial assessment has been done by the DAP, which means the community view is not factored into the draft assessment. This means the community voice is not given any consideration through the assessment. The community voice is shut out. This is entirely unfair, Mr President. Coming to a hearing to make a representation when a draft assessment has already been done is too late in the process to feel like you have any chance of genuinely being heard. Also of concern to the community is that the proposed DAP model removes the community right for merit-based planning appeals on the issues the community cares about, such as height, bulk, scale or appearance of buildings and impacts to streetscapes and adjoining properties. TASCAT review of decisions under the current appeals process is an essential part of the democratic system of government based on checks and balances. Under the draft legislation, developments will only be appealable to the Supreme Court based on a point of law or process which have a narrow focus and are prohibitively expensive. I, like the sector, support the concept of DAPs to promote the best possible planning processes and fair decisions, but I can't support this bill. Mr President, I urge members to join me in rejecting it so that together we can send a strong message to the government that they ought to listen to and work meaningfully with the local government sector, the experts, in developing a model that enhances, rather than diminishing, the confidence in the planning system.